November 17, 1928. The Lexington Hotel in Chicago stood like a fortress of polished marble and sharp shadows, its grand chandelier throwing fractured light across the lobby, the kind of opulence that only the roaring 20s could muster. Yet beneath the glitter, tension crackled like static in the air. Men in tailored suits whispered urgently in corners. Bellhops moved with practiced silence, knowing which footsteps were harmless and which carried danger. In the center of it all, Al Capone sat like a king on his throne, flanked by his bodyguards, each man a silent warning of the violence that followed him. The mere click of Capone's polished shoes against the marble could silence a room. Chicago was a city ruled by liquor, bullets, and fear. Gang wars spilled into the streets like river floods. Corrupt cops took bribes in cash and favors, turning blind eyes to murders and speakeasy raids alike. In this world, power wasn't just possession. It was perception, and Capone had both in spades. Al Capone was 29 years old, yet he already controlled a criminal empire that funneled over $100 million annually from bootlegging, gambling, and protection rackets. Newspapers whispered his name with both dread and fascination. Ruthless yet cunning, he knew when to strike with violence and when to negotiate with subtlety. His enemies were many, but his strategy was sharper than most of their bullets. Chicago had learned the hard way that challenging him meant death, ruin, or both. Recent gang wars had painted the streets red. His reputation wasn't built on rumor, it was carved in blood and enforced with precision. The empire he had forged was both admired and feared nationwide. And now, into his carefully constructed world, stepped a young man from Harlem. Edward "Bumpy" Johnson was 23. Harlem-born, Harlem-raised, an emissary for the legendary Madame Stephanie St. Clair, he carried the weight of a growing numbers racket in his pocket and the sharp edge of street intelligence in his mind. Harlem had taught him early that survival required more than muscle. It required strategy, foresight, and the ability to read men before they revealed themselves. Bumpy was fearless, but calculated, bold, yet patient. His reputation had begun to grow quietly in the shadows of Harlem's alleys and smoky gambling halls. He was young, but his mind was old with understanding of human weakness and leverage. In a world where most fought with guns, Bumpy fought with ideas. The stakes could not have been higher. For Capone, maintaining dominance meant avoiding unnecessary conflict. Each gang war drained resources, invited law enforcement scrutiny, and threatened to destabilize his empire. Harlem, meanwhile, represented untapped wealth, a numbers racket that flowed like quiet gold through the hands of black operators. Until now, Italian gangs had largely ignored it, dismissing it as small-time business. But the appearance of a confident young black gangster walking into Chicago with a proposition changed that. The racial and cultural tension in the room was palpable. It was more than business. It was an intrusion into territory where Capone's word was law. Bumpy Johnson didn't come with bullets or threats. He came with leverage, intelligence, and a plan that would not only preserve Harlem's independence but also ripple through organized crime for decades. In that Lexington Hotel lobby, the collision of youth and experience, audacity and power, strategy and violence was about to unfold. The outcome would not just shape a city, it would shape history. Prohibition had transformed America into a nation of secret stills, speakeasies, and shadow economies. The 18th Amendment promised morality and temperance, but instead it handed ambitious men a license to profit. Alcohol became more than a drink. It became currency, a weapon, and a status symbol. Bootlegging empires sprouted like weeds across Chicago, New York, and every city where opportunity met greed. Violence was baked into the business model. Assassinations, drive-by shootings, and brutal intimidation weren't exceptions. They were standard operating procedures. Enforcing respect wasn't optional, it was survival. And the ones who thrived were the ones who could wield fear as deftly as money. At the heart of Chicago's criminal web was the Italian mafia, and none shone brighter or darker than Al Capone. The Chicago outfit was a highly structured organization, blending military precision with street-level ruthlessness. Capone's rise was meteoric. He had absorbed the lessons of predecessors, exploited political corruption, and eliminated rivals with cold calculation. The city's politicians, law enforcement, and even judges often bowed to his influence. For Capone, violence was both a tool and a message. A calculated strike could secure territory or silence a challenger. White gangsters often viewed black neighborhoods with a mix of condescension and greed. They assumed these areas were easy pickings, small-time operations that could be controlled without negotiation. But that assumption underestimated Harlem's organization, intelligence, and resolve. Harlem, meanwhile, had become a unique enclave of cultural, economic, and social power. At the heart of its underground economy was Stephanie St. Clair. Her numbers racket was both highly profitable and meticulously organized. Bettors placed small, seemingly insignificant wagers daily, but the cumulative effect was enormous. Payouts were large, logistics precise, and the network extended across businesses, laundries, and barbershops. Harlem wasn't just profitable. It was a hub of black culture, pride, and enterprise. Disrupting it wasn't just business. It was a confrontation with a community's autonomy and influence. Bumpy Johnson had been an apprentice to St. Clair, learning the subtleties of risk, negotiation, and territory control. He understood that influence didn't always flow from violence. Reputation, information, and strategic alliances were often more powerful currencies. His mind worked like a ledger, weighing odds, calculating risk, and identifying leverage others overlooked. At 23, he had already developed a knack for turning small advantages into decisive wins. He saw patterns where others saw chaos and opportunities where others saw obstacles. Racial dynamics further complicated the criminal landscape. Segregation wasn't just social, it was structural. Black operators often faced both legal oppression and violent interference from white gangs. Cross-racial negotiations were rare, delicate, and deadly. Stepping into a negotiation with someone like Capone could have ended in death, yet Bumpy's audacity, combined with careful planning, turned the inherent risk into a form of leverage. His willingness to confront Chicago's most feared gangster signaled not recklessness, but a profound understanding of power, psychology, and circumstance. Bumpy Johnson arrived in Chicago under a cloak of discretion. The train ride from New York had been uneventful, but every mile brought a gnawing awareness of what awaited. Harlem was a world he knew, but Chicago belonged to Capone. Slipping through the station unnoticed, avoiding curious eyes, he understood that a single misstep could cost him his life. His appearance was unassuming, clothes neat but not flashy, eyes sharp, every movement deliberate. Nerves pulsed beneath his calm exterior, but confidence anchored him. He carried not weapons but leverage, and he knew leverage could speak louder than bullets. The Lexington Hotel loomed as a symbol of wealth and menace. Polished marble floors reflected chandeliers, while the murmur of businessmen and the shuffle of guards created an atmosphere both grand and suffocating. Capone's security detail patrolled silently, eyes like hawks, hands near holsters. The lobby smelled of cigar smoke, expensive cologne, and subtle danger. Bumpy's steps were measured, his mind cataloguing exits, noting staff, calculating every potential threat. He felt the weight of history pressing on him. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a test of wit, nerve, and survival. Capone greeted him with a handshake that was firm but measured, a gesture of cordiality layered with menace. At 29, Capone understood the power of appearances. He could exude respect while signaling dominance, and his smile was both invitation and warning. He studied Bumpy carefully. Posture, eyes, tone of voice, every detail spoke volumes. Capone assessed not just a man, but a potential ally or rival, weighing the benefit of cooperation against the risk of betrayal. The initial exchange was polite, yet charged. Bumpy began by presenting Madame St. Clair's proposition. He described Harlem's numbers operation with precision, highlighting its profitability and efficiency. Capone listened, brow furrowed, masking skepticism. The Italian gangster's instincts were trained to dismiss black operators, assuming territorial ignorance and weakness. He tested Bumpy with pointed questions, probing knowledge of the business, connections, and capacity to deliver. Every answer Bumpy gave was measured, revealing competence without arrogance. Bumpy outlined the losses Italian gangs incurred when trying to control Harlem through force. He proposed a 20% tribute in exchange for autonomy and protection. He framed the pitch not as confrontation, but collaboration. Harlem could remain its own ecosystem while still feeding Capone's empire. Bumpy emphasized long-term revenue over short-term conquest, showing that intelligence and foresight could trump brute force. He made it clear, Harlem wasn't a gamble. It was a calculated, profitable certainty. Capone leaned back, fingers steepled. The room seemed to shrink as he calculated the cost of violence versus partnership. Bloodshed could be avoided, his revenue expanded, and his empire's reach diversified. He understood that Bumpy's audacity, intelligence, and knowledge were assets. Agreeing to the deal was not concession, it was strategy. By leveraging Bumpy's network, Capone could gain a foothold in Harlem without firing a shot. Tension crackled in the air. Small gestures, silences, and words carried the weight of life and death. Bumpy's body remained calm, but every sense was alert. The guards, the glint of a hidden weapon, the ever-present potential for betrayal. Capone allowed a moment of suspense, a hint that the young emissary's life could be forfeit, yet he did not act. Intelligence, cunning, and clarity had secured Bumpy's survival. In that room, fear bowed to strategy, and respect was forged not through bullets, but through understanding. The agreement between Bumpy Johnson and Al Capone was as precise as it was unprecedented. Financial terms were clear. Harlem's operators would pay a tribute of 15 to 20% of gross profits. Structured payments were to be consistent, transparent, and documented in ways that ensured both sides could trust the arrangement. Capone, ever pragmatic, appreciated certainty. Violence and guesswork were costly, whereas predictability created value. Bumpy, understanding the delicate balance, framed the tribute not as subordination, but as mutual benefit. Every coin that left Harlem enriched Capone's empire while leaving local operations largely untouched. Territorial autonomy was the cornerstone of the deal. Harlem's numbers game remained under the control of black operators, free from Italian interference. Capone's recognition of this autonomy was rare, almost revolutionary. Respect was mutual. Bumpy and his colleagues were not subordinates, but partners in profit. The arrangement reframed traditional criminal hierarchies, creating a space where intelligence and reputation outweighed ethnicity or brute force. The streets of Harlem would remain under familiar hands, while Capone's organization enjoyed the benefits of revenue without direct management. Protection and enforcement were equally critical. Capone guaranteed that no outside Italian gang would encroach on Harlem's operations. He also used his influence to shield operators from certain corrupt law enforcement pressures where possible. The understanding was unspoken but clear. Harlem's success required security, and security required Capone's backing. Bumpy, in turn, committed to maintaining order, ensuring that the tribute flowed without incident. The deal created a rare equilibrium between respect, protection, and efficiency in a world defined by violence. Knowledge sharing formed an unexpected pillar of the agreement. Bumpy and his associates taught Capone's organization the mechanics of the numbers game. Systems for collecting, tracking, and distributing bets were sophisticated, highly profitable, and unfamiliar to Italian gangs. Capone recognized Harlem's methods as innovative, and he saw the value in integrating these strategies to diversify revenue streams. The transaction was more than money. It was an exchange of intelligence, a recognition that Harlem's operations were a model worth studying and preserving. Secrecy and discretion were paramount. Publicly, nothing about the arrangement would change. The streets would not know, newspapers would not report, and law enforcement would remain oblivious. The real power dynamic, Harlem's autonomy backed by Capone's protection, was hidden, preventing reputational damage or external threats. Leverage, not visibility, was the currency of influence. This invisible architecture of power allowed both sides to prosper without drawing attention or inviting conflict. Dispute resolution was centralized through Bumpy himself. He served as liaison between Harlem and Capone's organization, mediating disagreements, enforcing terms, and ensuring accountability. Violence was a last resort, and persuasion, reputation, and strategic leverage were the tools of enforcement. Bumpy's role elevated him from operator to arbiter, consolidating authority while maintaining harmony. In this system, negotiation and foresight replaced gunfire, creating a durable, profitable, and surprisingly stable arrangement. Bumpy Johnson's arrival in Chicago was more than a formality. It was the beginning of a delicate orchestration. He met Capone's lieutenants in smoke-filled rooms, navigating a world of wary glances and subtle threats. Teaching the numbers game was part pedagogy, part diplomacy. He explained the systems of collection, the methods of tracking bets, and the discipline required to avoid mistakes. Every lesson reinforced the stakes: profit, order, and survival. Cultural and racial tensions lingered in the air, but Bumpy's calm confidence and sharp intellect began to build trust. Slowly, the Italian lieutenants recognized that Harlem's operator was no ordinary emissary. Tribute payments became the tangible proof of the deal's success. Structured and predictable, the payments flowed on a schedule that ensured accountability. Capone, previously reliant on coercion and fear, now had a steady, reliable revenue stream. Harlem operators, in turn, enjoyed stability, knowing that Italian interference would be minimal and predictable. The arrangement turned unpredictability into a controlled flow of capital, a rare commodity in the chaotic world of organized crime. Bumpy's careful oversight ensured that both sides adhered to the terms, preventing misunderstandings that could quickly escalate into violence. One of the most immediate effects of the agreement was the de-escalation of violence. Gang wars that had plagued both Harlem and Chicago slowed as clarity and respect replaced suspicion and territorial greed. Killings and ambushes were no longer the first solution. Mutual respect, enforced through structured agreements and strategic oversight, became the currency of influence. Bumpy's reputation for calm authority ensured compliance without gunfire. Every successful payment and smooth operation reinforced the stability of the arrangement, proving that intelligence and negotiation could rival brute force. The model's success did not go unnoticed. Other cities watched as Harlem's operators maintained autonomy while generating consistent revenue. New York, Detroit, and other urban centers began to replicate similar systems, borrowing the lessons of structure, discipline, and respect. Harlem's operators gained a reputation not only for profitability, but for organizational skill and strategic thinking. Bumpy's approach demonstrated that leadership required foresight, leverage, and negotiation as much as courage. His name quietly traveled beyond the borders of Harlem, whispered with a mix of fear and admiration. Through this process, Bumpy Johnson's influence grew exponentially. He became a mentor and broker for younger black gangsters, teaching them how to negotiate, manage operations, and wield intelligence as a weapon. His prestige increased because he never had to fire a shot to enforce authority. Fear and respect coexisted in a way that elevated him above ordinary operators. The deal with Capone became both shield and ladder, protecting Harlem while consolidating Bumpy's role as a strategic powerhouse in organized crime. In a world built on violence, he proved that leverage, intellect, and timing could command more power than a pistol ever could. The deal between Bumpy Johnson and Al Capone rippled far beyond Harlem and Chicago, reshaping the very architecture of organized crime. Italian-American mobsters like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky observed the principles Bumpy had quietly enforced: territorial exclusivity, structured tribute, and dispute resolution without unnecessary violence. The arrangement showed that collaboration, negotiation, and strategic oversight could create stability where brute force often failed. Bumpy's model became a blueprint, quietly informing decisions in commissions and councils that governed criminal empires across the nation. Harlem's economic stability was perhaps the most visible consequence. With Italian interference curtailed and police corruption mitigated through careful maneuvering, the numbers racket thrived. Profits flowed more consistently, allowing black entrepreneurs and operators to invest, expand, and sustain livelihoods. The arrangement fostered a sense of order and predictability in a community otherwise vulnerable to exploitation. Even as Prohibition-era chaos raged nationwide, Harlem became a rare example of disciplined criminal enterprise that benefited the local population as much as the operators themselves. Bumpy Johnson's personal legacy was cemented by this achievement. He emerged as a power broker, strategist, and symbol of pragmatic strength. While many contemporaries relied on guns and intimidation, Bumpy relied on leverage, intelligence, and timing. He survived rivalries, earned respect across racial and criminal lines, and became a figure whose influence stretched across decades. Stories of his negotiation with Capone circulated quietly, a testament to brains over bullets. In Harlem and beyond, Bumpy's name became shorthand for cunning, courage and the ability to command respect without violence. For Al Capone, the arrangement reinforced his reputation not only as a feared gangster but as a strategic genius. He recognized that constant violence drained resources, attracted law enforcement scrutiny, and destabilized profits. By cooperating with Bumpy, he gained steady revenue and insight into an entirely new business model without compromising his control over Chicago. The deal allowed him to expand influence quietly, efficiently, and profitably. It was a lesson in long-term strategy that complemented the brutality he was already known for. Secrecy was essential to the deal's success. Publicly, nothing changed in Harlem or Chicago. To outsiders, Capone maintained the appearance of dominance, and Harlem operators continued their operations undisturbed. Only the inner circles of both organizations fully understood the new dynamic. This discretion protected reputations, avoided unnecessary law enforcement attention, and ensured that leverage remained invisible, yet unassailable. The durability of Bumpy Johnson's arrangement proved remarkable. It survived Capone's eventual imprisonment, outlasted short-term rivalries, and influenced organized crime for decades. Operators in other cities quietly adopted similar principles of tribute, autonomy, and negotiation. The system began to fracture only with societal shifts: decline of prohibition, rise of narcotics, and changing policing strategies. Yet the foundations Bumpy had laid endured, a testament to the power of intellect and strategy in a world built on violence. In the end, the deal with Capone was more than a tactical victory. It was a statement about power, leverage, and vision. Harlem's operators prospered, Capone's empire became more efficient, and Bumpy Johnson's name entered the pantheon of criminal strategists whose influence transcended bullets and bloodshed. This arrangement illustrated a central truth. Sometimes, the most lasting power is not shouted from the streets. It is quietly, brilliantly negotiated in smoke-filled rooms.